The fate of Selenia hung by a thread. In the grand royal summoning chamber, the air was heavy with the scent of incense and the static electricity of ancient magic. Gothic stained glass windows filtered the light into divine beams that illuminated the runic circle at the center of the hall. Sir Valerius, with his polished armor reflecting the tension of the moment, held his breath. The mages chanted the final syllable of the forbidden incantation, hoping that the legendary hero of the Holy Spear would emerge to eradicate the evil. There was an explosion of blinding light, a crash that shook the castle's foundations, and then silence. When the mystical smoke cleared, there was no golden warrior. There was only a man in a cheap hoodie, sitting cross-legged on the marble floor. Takeshi Umori blinked, looked around with hollow eyes, and, with the most natural air in the world, took a loud bite of a convenience store onigiri he was still holding. The sound of the plastic being crinkled echoed embarrassingly through the sacred hall, making Sir Valerius's jaw drop nearly to the floor. Confusion reigned. While the guards tried to figure out if this was a joke from the gods, Alara Dewdrop Leaf stepped forward, attempting to save the dignity of the moment. With elven elegance, she began to recite the terrible prophecy of the demon lord and the need to save the world. Takeshi, however, was far too busy searching for crumbs on his clothes and asking if the royal banquet would have pudding. His apathy was impenetrable. Desperate, Alara mentioned the dangers of the path, citing the nest of the golden griffin atop the mountain of affliction. Upon hearing the word griffin, Takeshi yawned, but when the elf accidentally commented that the griffin egg was the rarest culinary ingredient in the world, the atmosphere changed. The summoned one's face was transformed, his eyes gleamed with a frightening intensity, and drool began to trickle from his mouth. He didn't want to save the world, he wanted to make an omelet. Before anyone could react, he pocketed a ceremonial silver salt shaker from a nearby table, muttering that he would need seasoning. Determined to head north, where the mountain lay, Takeshi demanded a map. Sir Valerius tried to block his path, but the glutton spotted the royal compass, a sacred jewel-encrusted artifact atop a pedestal. Reasoning that he needed an inner sense of direction, Takeshi grabbed the object and swallowed it whole in one crunchy and terrifying bite. The effect was immediate and ridiculous. Takeshi's nose turned a glowing incandescent red, transforming into a sharp metallic point. An invisible and violent magnetic force pulled his face with full strength toward the north. His body lagged behind, stretched out like rubber, while his feet slid uncontrollably across the marble. Panicking, he grabbed the first thing he saw to hold on, Alara's cape. The result was catastrophic. The compass nose dragged them both with the force of a freight train, smashing through the castle's solid stone wall and leaving behind only a cloud of dust and a hole in the exact shape of a human and a desperate elf. The law of gravity, which had been temporarily suspended by magnetic madness, decided to collect its debt with interest. Takeshi Umori's nose suddenly lost its incandescent glow, and the invisible force that was dragging them vanished. The result was immediate. Takeshi and his involuntary passenger, Alara Dewdrop Leaf, plummeted from the sky, colliding with the treetops of the ancient forest before landing face first on the packed earth of the road. When the dust cloud settled, Alara stood up, trembling. The elf, once immaculate, now looked like a ghost made of lime and castle wall debris. She spat out a piece of plaster and glared with murderous fury at her kidnapper. Takeshi, for his part, was cleaning his ear with his pinky finger, completely unharmed thanks to his absurd constitution, and complained loudly that the air transport service of that world didn't serve in-flight snacks. His priority remained unshakable. His stomach growled loud enough to startle the local birds. Before Alara could strangle the summoned hero, a blinding light blocked the path. It wasn't the sun, nor holy magic, but rather the excessive glint from the teeth of a man standing in the middle of the road. Kalen of the Holy Spear stood there, in a pose so dramatically rehearsed that it seemed to defy human anatomy. Rose petals appeared out of nowhere around him, floating in a breeze that existed only to sway his perfect blonde hair. With a voice projected for the back of a theater, Kalen declared that he would not allow an impostor to profane the sacred quest. He pointed his golden spear at Takeshi's nose, challenging him to a duel of honor. Takeshi blinked, looked around searching for who the imposter was, and then asked with genuine curiosity if the boy in the shiny outfit was the mascot for some nearby themed restaurant. While Kalen, red with indignation, began to recite his noble lineage and heroic deeds, Takeshi's attention drifted. Something gray and viscous crawled slowly along the roadside, a cement slime, a common pest in the region known for its fatal indigestion. To the eyes of a desperate glutton, however, it looked suspiciously like a giant black sesame pudding. Completely ignoring his rival's passionate speech about justice and destiny, Takeshi crouched down, picked up the creature with both hands, and swallowed it in one gulp. Alara screamed in horror, but it was too late. Takeshi's body hardened instantly. His skin took on the rough gray texture of a poorly made sidewalk, and his form rounded and expanded until he became a human block of solid concrete, square and incredibly heavy. Kalen interpreted the grotesque transformation as a high-level defensive technique. Shouting the name of his special move, he charged with supersonic speed, thrusting his spear against his opponent's petrified stomach. There was a dry, sad sound of metal snapping. The legendary spear shattered like glass against the cement belly of Takeshi, who didn't even feel the impact. The problem, however, was balance. Shaped like a giant die and without functional knees, Takeshi swayed forward. Gravity, once again acting as an agent of chaos, did the rest. He tipped over slowly, rolling down the hill with the subtlety of a landslide. Kalen, still in shock from the loss of his weapon, had no time to dodge. The sound of a handsome hero being flattened by 2 tons of concrete and stupidity echoed through the forest, followed by the rhythmic noise of Takeshi rolling down the road, screaming that the pudding was too dry. Far away, in the royal castle of Selenia, the situation was less comical and more apocalyptic. Sir Valerius stood before the gigantic hole in the throne room wall, a vein pulsing dangerously in his forehead. He watched the northern horizon, where a trail of fallen trees marked the passage of the supposed savior. The captain was no longer just confused, he was determined. He ordered his lieutenants to prepare the elite cavalry and bring the dragon capture nets. If the hero would not save the world willingly, he would be dragged toward his heroic destiny by force, even if Valerius had to tie him up and feed him military rations for the rest of the journey. After the incident of the rolling concrete hero, the Royal Cavalry of Selenia proved its legendary efficiency, thanks to shortcuts known only to the military elite and the fact that Takeshi Umori had made several unscheduled stops to try and bite rocks that looked like potato breads. Sir Valerius managed to reach the base of the Mountain of Affliction first. The scene was one of martial discipline capable of making a sergeant cry with emotion. In record time, a fortification of reinforced oak wood was erected, blocking the only safe trail to the summit. Royal banners fluttered in the wind, catapults were loaded, and 300 elite archers kept their bows drawn, aimed at the edge of the forest. At the center of it all, Sir Valerius watched the horizon with his arms crossed, radiating an aura of absolute authority. He had sworn that the walking chaos would be contained there, even if it required the use of titanium nets. The tense tranquility was broken not by a war cry, but by the sound of shuffling footsteps and a stomach growling with the ferocity of a hibernating bear. Takeshi Umori emerged from the bushes, finally free of his concrete form, but visibly pale with hunger. Right behind him, Alara Dewdrop Leaf tried to maintain her dignity while brushing dry leaves from her hair, muttering prayers to deities of patience. Takeshi's eyes, completely ignoring the 300 arrows aimed at his chest, fixed on a thorny bush growing from the volcanic rock. On it, small and inviting red fruits glistened. To a botanist, those were the dreaded volcanic peppers, known for containing the concentrated essence of liquid magma. To Takeshi, they were clearly wild strawberries. Alara reached out to warn him, shouting that those would melt an ogre's insides, but the speed of gluttony surpassed the speed of sound. Takeshi ripped out the entire bush and tossed the fruits into his mouth as if they were popcorn. The effect was instantaneous and visually terrifying. Takeshi's face transitioned from pale to a pulsing neon red, and black smoke began to pour from his ears with the hiss of a pressure cooker. Sir Valerius, interpreting that as the charging of a forbidden apocalypse-level spell, desperately ordered the shields to be raised. Takeshi doubled over, clutching his stomach, and opened his mouth in a silent grimace of pain. What came out was not a plea for help, but a burp of biblical proportions. A continuous jet of fire, drawn with chaotic lines and shapes that resembled screaming skulls, erupted from his throat. The torrent of flames swept across the road, incinerating the reinforced wooden palisades as if they were matchsticks, and turning the army's flawless tactical formation into a disorganized stampede of men running with scorched pants. When the gastric eruption finally ceased, only silence and the smell of burnt wood remained. The impenetrable barricade had been reduced to smoldering ashes, opening a direct path for the mountain ascent. Sir Valerius stood in the middle of the debris, covered in soot from head to toe, with his velvet cloak reduced to black rags, blinking in disbelief at the destruction of his military planning. Takeshi patted his chest, released one last puff of smoke in the shape of a ring, and commented that the local strawberries were a bit too spicy for his taste. He began to walk through the remains of the fortification, ignoring the traumatized soldiers, until he stopped and looked up. The path was clear of soldiers, but the mountain of affliction now loomed like a vertical wall of sharp rock, too high to be climbed by someone who had just lunched on explosive peppers. The smoke from Takeshi Umori's volcanic belch had barely dissipated when the reality of the situation set in. Before them, the mountain of affliction was not just a steep climb. It was a wall of black rock, vertical and hostile, that seemed to claw at the sky itself. For any normal adventurer, that would be a life or death challenge. For Takeshi, it was, above all, an administrative inconvenience. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun, and then looked at his own hands, still stained with soot. With the gravity of a philosopher, he declared that climbing that on foot would burn too many calories and make the meat tough. Alara Dewdrop Leaf, who was checking if her arrows had survived the previous explosion, only sighed. She knew that his logic operated on a frequency different from sanity. It was then that luck, or Selenia's cosmic misfortune, intervened. Perched on a nearby rock, a peculiar animal observed the scene. It was a balloon bird, a spherical and light creature known for inflating itself with natural gases to float between peaks and escape predators. For the local fauna, it was a fascinating defense mechanism. To Takeshi's hungry eyes, it looked like a giant marshmallow with a beak. Before Alara could recite the paragraph from the royal bestiary that listed the balloon bird as unfit for consumption due to a high concentration of organic helium, Takeshi had already acted. With a swift and predatory movement, he swallowed the creature whole, without even chewing properly. The effect of the mimetic metabolism was instantaneous and comical. Takeshi's body swelled with a muffled sound of stretching rubber. His arms and legs became short, conical appendages protruding from a perfectly spherical torso. His eyes widened as his feet lost contact with the ground. He wasn't just fat, he was lighter than air. Realizing that her hero was about to become the kingdom's first artificial satellite of fat, Alara reacted with the instinct of an elite ranger. She drew her lasso of elven rope and, in a fluid motion, snared Takeshi's left ankle seconds before he cleared the tree canopy. Now, she held the end of the rope, anchoring to the ground a human balloon that groaned with a thin, distorted voice. The ascent began, but not as the legends would describe it. Alara climbed the rock face with skill, digging her boots into the crevices and using the strength of her entire body. The problem was that, tied to her waist, Takeshi floated, swaying violently at the mercy of the rising air currents. To anyone watching from afar, it looked like a giant child playing with a very ugly kite. Takeshi spun on his own axis, his face green with motion sickness, alternating between staring at the horizon and looking down at the deadly abyss below. He tried to complain about the turbulence, but his voice, affected by the bird's gases, came out high-pitched like a squirrel inhaling helium, stripping any dignity from his protests. The wind howled, tossing the spherical body from side to side. With every stronger gust, Alara had to grip the rope with both hands, the veins in her forehead bulging, silently questioning every life choice that had led her to that moment. She wasn't just fighting gravity, she was fighting the clumsy aerodynamics of an inflatable glutton. The altitude brought new dangers. Flocks of aerial monsters, which would normally be a lethal threat, met a humiliating fate. A harpy dove with sharp talons, ready to attack the elf, but was intercepted mid-air by a dull thud against Takeshi's elastic belly. The creature was hurled away, spinning in confusion. Takeshi's inflated body functioned as an involuntary wrecking ball. The wind threw him against the mountain wall, where he bounced with a comical bowing sound, ricocheted off giant eagle nests, and ran over stone gargoyles that were attempting to take flight. He had no control at all, spinning wildly, his short limbs flailing uselessly in the air. Alara simply lowered her head and kept climbing, using Takeshi's impacts as a distraction for the enemies. It was a revolutionary combat strategy, using the hero as a shield, a concussion weapon, and bait, all at the same time. When the mountain peak finally appeared, it was not a graceful arrival. A final thermal current caught Takeshi and pulled him upward violently, dragging Alara the last few meters over the edge of the cliff. They flew through the air, describing a perfect arc, and fell. The impact was cushioned by something soft, warm, and smelling of old straw. Takeshi, whose balloon bird effect began to wear off with a long and embarrassing deflating sound, landed face first on the ground. As he lifted his head, withered and dizzy, his eyes gleamed. They hadn't fallen just anywhere. They were in the center of a colossal nest, made of entire tree trunks and whale bones. And right in the middle rested the object of desire that had started all that madness, the gigantic golden griffin egg, shimmering under the sunlight. But before Takeshi could even think about reaching for the salt, an immense shadow covered the nest, blocking out the sun. The shadow that covered the nest did not belong to a passing cloud, but rather to a living legend made of golden feathers, steel claws, and a foul temper. The golden griffin, supreme guardian of the mountain of affliction, landed with an impact that made the whalebone structure tremble. For Alara Dewdrop Leaf, this was the end of the line. The creature emanated an aura of lethal majesty that paralyzed even the most experienced warriors. She cowered behind a trunk, praying that her ancestors would receive her with dignity. However, dignity was in short supply at the center of the nest. Takeshi Umori, still half-dazed and with flaccid skin after having served as a human helium balloon, did not seem to notice he was in the presence of an S-rank monster. His eyes were fixed on the golden egg as if it were the last drumstick in the display case. He ignored the beast's deafening roar, which could burst eardrums miles away, and simply grumbled that all that shouting was going to ruin the texture of the yolk. Offended by the insolence of that human appetizer, the griffin prepared to attack, opening its beak capable of splitting armor in half. It was at this critical moment that Takeshi's scattered attention caught something growing in the rotting wood of the nest, a colony of deep sleep mushrooms, purple fungi known for taking down elephants with a single spore. Without hesitation, and driven by the logic that mushrooms go well with eggs, he plucked a handful and swallowed them all at once. The griffin's attack came swiftly, a deadly dive toward the intruder, but Takeshi's mimetic metabolism was faster. Instead of gaining claws or wings, he opened his mouth and let out a colossal yawn. A dense cloud of purple dust was expelled from his lungs, hitting the monster squarely in the face. The effect was instantaneous and ridiculous. The beast's eyes rolled, its wings went limp, and the apex predator collapsed to the ground with a snore that made the mountain vibrate, transformed into a giant fluffy rug. As the dust settled and the sound of snoring filled the air, two gloved and trembling hands gripped the edge of the cliff. Sir Valerius hauled himself up, his shining armor now dented, scorched, and covered in soot from the previous explosion. Right behind him, Kalen of the Holy Spear emerged, his handsome and dramatic face smeared with dirt, gasping for air after racing up the mountain to save the day. They drew their weapons, ready for the most epic battle of their lives, expecting to find blood and destruction. Instead, they found a surreal domestic scene. The invincible monster slept with its tongue out, blowing bubbles through its nose. Alara sat on the ground, staring into space with the vacant look of someone who had given up on understanding the universe. And in the center of it all, Takeshi was far too busy trying to balance the giant egg on a black stone that absorbed the heat of the sun. The newcomer's tension dissipated into absolute confusion. Takeshi, using a sharp stone, cracked the shell of the golden griffin egg. The contents sizzled as they touched the overheated rock, releasing an aroma that, to be fair, was heavenly. It was the smell of victory, of adventure, and of pure cholesterol. Kalen tried to begin a speech about the desecration of sacred nature, but was interrupted by Valerius's stomach growling loudly, betraying the knight's honor. With the patience of a Michelin-starred chef, Takeshi waited for the perfect moment. He pulled a fork and a knife from his pocket, heaven knows where he kept cutlery all the time, and cut a generous piece of the legendary omelet. The world seemed to have stopped. The three observers held their breath. That was the goal of the entire chaotic journey, the flavor that motivated the destruction of military barriers and the use of birds as aerial transport. Takeshi chewed. He frowned. He chewed a bit more. He swallowed. He looked toward the horizon, then at the egg, and let out a deep sigh of disappointment that weighed more than the griffin itself. With a voice heavy with genuine sadness, he declared that it lacked salt. The texture was good, he said, but without seasoning, it was just bland protein. While Sir Valerius fell to his knees, defeated by the triviality of the situation, Takeshi was already pulling the crumpled map from his pocket. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and casually asked if anyone knew where the so-called Chocolate Dragon Valley was, because he urgently needed a dessert to get the taste of unsalted egg out of his mouth. The egg hunt had ended. The hunt for sweets was just beginning. Takeshi Umori's food critique regarding the lack of salt in the legendary egg was still echoing off the stones when the mountain trembled. It was not an earthquake, but rather the muscle spasm of a golden griffin waking up with the worst headache of the last 3 centuries. The effect of the sleep mushrooms had worn off, leaving behind only a pulsing migraine and a deadly hatred. The creature opened a gigantic eye, bloodshot and with pulsing veins, focusing directly on the group that had turned its nest into a self-service buffet. Sir Valerius, who was still on his knees lamenting the situation, regained his survival instinct in record time. He shouted an order for a tactical retreat, which basically meant run for your lives, while the griffin let out a screech that sounded like 1,000 forks scratching a blackboard. Alara Dewdrop Leaf was already 2 steps ahead, pulling Takeshi by the collar, as the hero seemed more concerned with gathering the eggshells to lick later. With a flap of wings that generated a local hurricane, the monster swept half of the nest off the cliff, taking our adventurers along with the debris into a dizzying freefall. Falling off a mountain is usually the end of the story, but physics in Selenia has the terrible habit of bending to Takeshi's stupidity. As they plummeted, he decided it was the ideal moment to consult the map of the Chocolate Dragon Valley. Upon opening the giant parchment against the wind, the paper acted like a sail, and Takeshi, who still had remnants of helium gas from the balloon bird in his digestive system, swelled up instantly. The scene was worthy of an abstract Renaissance painting. Takeshi transformed into a spherical human balloon, holding the map above his head like a parachute, while Sir Valerius, Kalen, and Alara clung to his legs and belt, forming a human chain of despair. Kalen tried to strike a heroic pose even while hanging by his ankle, but the wind whipping against his face only made him look like a fish out of water. Above them, the griffin gave up the pursuit, preferring to go back to sleep rather than deal with that floating bizarreness. And the slow and humiliating descent seemed to be leading them toward the safety of the forest at the foot of the mountain. Sir Valerius began to calculate the route to the nearest outpost, but he underestimated the protagonist's nose. Suddenly, Takeshi's nostrils flared. His eyes, previously vacant, gleamed with a maniacal intensity. He sensed something, an aroma, a pungent, earthy, and musty fragrance rising from a dark valley to the left. Ignoring aerodynamics and common sense, Takeshi declared he smelled aged imperial blue cheese and, in a sudden movement, released the air from his cheeks to propel himself toward the odor. The group veered violently in the air, colliding with the canopies of dead trees and landing with a dull and dusty thud in a clearing where no grass grew and the sun seemed afraid to touch. As they coughed the gray dust from their lungs, Alara looked around and felt her blood run cold. Before them loomed a structure of black stone, covered in runes that pulsed with a sickly greenish light. The smell in the air was unbearable, a mixture of sulfur, ancient decay, and hopelessness. She covered her nose, immediately recognizing the forbidden architecture. It was the entrance to the legendary Tomb of 1,000 Laments. But where the elf saw death, Takeshi saw opportunity. He stood there, inhaling that toxic miasma deeply, as if he were at a wine tasting. He argued with absolute conviction that such a scent could only come from a fermentation chamber of millennial cheeses, likely guarded by monks who understood the value of mold. Valerius tried to explain that it was literally the smell of rotting souls, but he was ignored. Before the magically sealed gate, which had not been opened since the Dark Age, Alara begged them to turn back. She explained that the door required a blood sacrifice, or a key forged in the flames of hell. Takeshi, however, merely rummaged through the pockets of his baggy pants. With the smile of someone who knows exactly what they are doing, even though he never does, he pulled out a metallic object. It was not a sacred relic, nor a magical artifact. It was an ornate silver fork that he had borrowed from the king's table in the first chapter. He looked at his terrified companions and announced that no pantry door could withstand a hungry man with the right utensil. He stepped toward the cursed lock, ready to commit the greatest archaeological mistake in history. The silence in the cursed valley was absolute, broken only by the metallic sound of a piece of silverware scraping against an ancient protection rune. Alara Dewdrop Leaf covered her eyes, unable to watch the profanation, while Takeshi Umori inserted the silver fork directly into the center of the magic seal. By arcane logic, the intruder should have been vaporized by a black lightning bolt. By the logic of physics, the fork should have bent against the granite, but logic had stayed outside the mountain along with common sense. To Sir Valerius's existential horror, the solid stone reacted to the silverware as if it were a plate of freshly cooked spaghetti. With a flick of the wrist that denoted years of practice in Italian cantinas, Takeshi began to twirl the fork. The solid rock, the protection runes, and local reality itself distorted, winding into a perfect spiral around the silver tines, creating a circular opening where there had previously been an insurmountable barrier. The royal knight slumped into a sitting position, his armor clinking pathetically against the floor. Sir Valerius muttered something about the fundamental laws of conservation of mass, but he was ignored. Takeshi, satisfied with his gourmet breaking and entering job, gestured with the fork, now with a piece of stone wound around its tip, inviting the group to enter. Kalen of the Holy Spear, trying to recover his heroic posture after the humiliating journey, was the first to stand, adjusting his hair and pretending that twisting stone with silverware was a common technique in his homeland. The interior of the Tomb of 1,000 Laments was not inviting. The air was thick, damp, and glowed with a green bioluminescence that would make any health inspector condemn the place within a 5-kilometer radius. While Alara held her breath to avoid inhaling the spores of death, Takeshi took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with tears of emotion. He commented that the maturation chamber was perfect, and that the musty smell indicated a cheese of a legendary vintage, completely ignoring the skeletons of ancient adventurers that decorated the corridor. The gastronomic exploration was interrupted when the corridor widened into an antechamber. From the ceiling and walls, gelatinous and translucent masses began to ooze, coalescing on the floor with obscene sounds. Alara let out a shrill warning. They were vinegar slimes, creatures composed of concentrated acid capable of dissolving armor and bone in seconds. She drew her bow, and Valerius unsheathed his sword, preparing for a desperate battle against the corrosion. However, to Takeshi, that was not a biological threat. It was free salad dressing. Before the first slime could launch its acid jet, the glutton from another world charged forward. Ignoring the chemical burn that should have been happening, he pursed his lips and sucked. The sound was deafening, a slurp that echoed through the entire tomb. An entire row of gelatinous monsters was vacuumed into Takeshi's mouth as if they were a single endless strand of udon noodles, leaving the remaining slimes trembling with fear, an emotion that, until that moment, science did not know jellies could feel. The group watched, paralyzed, as Takeshi swallowed the last guardian of the tomb with a satisfied smack of his lips, wiping the corner of his mouth with his shirt sleeve. He complained that the seasoning was a bit too acidic and that it lacked a touch of olive oil to balance the pH. Kalen lowered his spear, feeling utterly useless, while Alara checked to see if her companion wasn't melting from the inside out. Suddenly, Takeshi's expression of gastronomic triumph shifted. His nose began to twitch, his eyes narrowed and grew watery. He pressed a finger to his nostrils, sniffing loudly. In a nasal voice, he commented that perhaps, just perhaps, he had a slight intolerance to pure vinegar in large quantities. He tilted his head back, his chest inflating in a dramatic and prolonged inhalation that sucked all the air out of the room. Sir Valerius widened his eyes, realizing too late that a sneeze from that man, charged with the acidic power he had just ingested, would be more devastating than any attack spell. Time seemed to freeze in the antechamber of the Tomb of 1,000 Laments. Takeshi Umori's chest was expanded to its limit, holding an amount of air that defied human anatomy, while his eyes watered with the fury of concentrated vinegar. Sir Valerius, recognizing the imminent danger of a biological detonation of catastrophic proportions, dove behind a stone pillar, shouting a command for cover that was drowned out by the sound of the nasal apocalypse. The sneeze was not merely a sound, it was a meteorological event. A pressurized jet of acidic mist and hurricane-force winds erupted from Takeshi, sweeping through the darkness of the corridor ahead. Alara Dewdrop Leaf shielded her face with her elven cloak, feeling the fabric sizzle slightly upon contact with the corrosive droplets bouncing off the walls. The sound of melting stone and dissolving metal filled the room, transforming the solemn atmosphere of the tomb into something reminiscent of an out-of-control industrial deep fryer. When the cloud of acrid vapor finally settled, the group emerged from their hiding places, coughing and with their eyes stinging. The corridor ahead, which had previously stretched into the menacing darkness, was unrecognizable. The polished stone floor had become a bubbling, steaming slurry. Alara pointed, trembling at the side walls. Where there should have been orifices for poisoned darts and pendulous blades, there were now only widened holes and liquefied metal dripping like candle wax. With a sigh of relief that smelled like seasoned salad, Takeshi wiped his nose on his shirt sleeve, casually commenting that he felt much lighter. He completely ignored the fact that he had just neutralized, via nasal secretion, one of the most lethal defense systems of antiquity. Sir Valerius looked at the steaming destruction and then at the glutton, internally questioning whether he should decorate him for bravery or arrest him for historical vandalism and a risk to public health. Determined not to be overshadowed by a sneeze, Kalen of the Holy Spear spotted, at the end of the corridor, a single mechanism that seemed to have survived the corrosion, a complex pressure plate blocking the passage to the final chamber. He dashed ahead, his hair swaying in a non-existent wind, and struck a dramatic pose, declaring that such a trap required the precision of a true hero to be disarmed. While Kalen lectured on honor and technique, Takeshi staggered past him, still suffering the side effects of accelerated digestion. The protagonist tripped over his own feet, and a heavy bead of sweat glowing with a greenish hue of acetic acid, flew from his forehead. The droplet landed with surgical precision on the trap's exposed gears. There was a sharp hiss, smoke rose, and the entire mechanism dissolved into a puddle of metallic sludge before the blonde hero could even touch it. Kalen remained frozen in his heroic pose, a perfect statue of irrelevance. The group finally entered the inner sanctuary of the Tomb of 1,000 Laments. The air there was heavy, stagnant for millennia, carrying a dense scent that made Sir Valerius instinctively reach for the hilt of his sword. For Takeshi, however, that putrid aroma of decay and sulfur was interpreted by his starving brain as the unmistakable scent of a blue cheese aged to perfection. In the center of the room, atop a raised dais surrounded by pulsing runes of dark energy, rested a massive obsidian sarcophagus. Takeshi began to salivate profusely, his eyes fixed on the giant cheese box. He moved forward, ignoring Alara's hysterical warnings about eternal curses, muttering only about the need to find crackers or a good wine to accompany the archaeological discovery. With the delicacy of a starving bear, Takeshi reached out toward the lid of the sarcophagus, already visualizing the creamy texture of what he imagined was inside. His fingers were mere centimeters from the black stone when the temperature of the room plummeted abruptly. The sarcophagus shuddered violently, causing dust to fall from the ceiling, and fissures of purple light began to spread across the surface of the obsidian. A guttural voice, which seemed to come from the depths of the earth and resonate in the bones of everyone present, echoed through the chamber, paralyzing even the protagonist's hunger for a brief second. "Who dares disturb my eternal slumber?" The lid of the sarcophagus exploded outward, and an armored hand, shrouded in black flames, gripped the edge of the tomb, announcing that whatever was inside was definitely not dairy. The obsidian lid of the sarcophagus didn't just fall, it was pulverized against the opposite wall with the force of a siege ram. From the midst of the cloud of secular dust and purple energy, a gigantic silhouette rose, blocking any hope of escape or sanity. General Malphus emerged from his millennial confinement, and he did not seem to be in a good morning mood. Standing over 2 meters tall, armored in black plates that seemed to absorb the little light from the torch, the demon exuded an atmospheric pressure that made Sir Valerius's knees tremble, despite all his royal training. Malphus's 4 red eyes swept across the room, glowing with an ancient malice. A long blood-red tabard hung from his waist, swaying with the draft of hot air generated by his own fury. Alara Dewdrop Leaf recoiled instinctively, her elven ears pressed flat against her head like those of a cornered animal, recognizing the aura of a predator that devoured entire armies even before humanity learned to forge steel. The room fell into absolute silence, except for the crackling of the black flames dancing on the general's shoulders. The demon puffed out his chest and began his mandatory villain speech, his voice resonating like thunder inside a cave, promising eternal pain and endless darkness to those insects who dared to interrupt his rest. While Kalen of the Holy Spear desperately tried to remember some prayer of protection, Takeshi Umari seemed to be in another mental time zone. The protagonist, irritated by the delay in service, crouched down and picked up a piece of the debris from the magic pedestal that glowed with containment runes. With the casualness of someone eating peanuts in a bar, he tossed the fragment of enchanted stone into his mouth and began to chew noisily. The sound of magic granite being crushed by Takeshi's reinforced teeth cut through Malphus's epic monologue. The general stopped in the middle of a sentence about rivers of blood, his 4 eyes blinking out of sync, trying to process the scene. Takeshi swallowed the boulder, feeling his stomach momentarily glow with an aura of mystical protection, and politely raised his hand. He asked, with the impatience of a VIP customer, if the gentleman in the red apron could kindly fetch the special cheese that was supposed to be on the top shelf, since the service was terrible. In General Malphus's tactical brain, trained through centuries of war, short-circuited. He looked at his own ceremonial tabard, then at the stupid-faced human, and realized the insinuation. The fury that exploded from him was not military, it was personal. He was not a waiter, he was the herald of despair. Sir Valerius shouted for everyone to get down, but it was too late. Malphus roared, and from his outstretched hands, a torrent of black flames of the underworld was fired directly at the insolent glutton. Hell took over the chamber. The heat was so intense that the stones of the walls began to vitrify instantly. Kalen covered his face, whimpering about how unfair it was to die so young and so handsome, while Alara watched in horror as Takeshi's silhouette disappeared completely within the vortex of cursed fire. For any normal living being, that would have been the end, ashes in the wind. But they forgot that Takeshi rarely respected the laws of physics or biology. When the jet of fire ceased, leaving only smoke and the smell of burnt ozone, Malphus smiled with sadistic satisfaction, expecting to see only a pair of smoldering shoes. Instead, what he saw made his eyes nearly pop out of their sockets. Takeshi was there, intact. His skin glowed faintly with the same energy as the runes from the pedestal he had just digested, acting as a perfect magical insulator against the demonic attack. But what truly shocked everyone wasn't his survival, it was what he was doing. The protagonist held an improvised fork, actually a piece of twisted metal from a previous trap, on the tip of which was skewered a large, yellowish limestone rock he had ripped from the bottom of the sarcophagus. He was using the black flames of the underworld, the fire capable of consuming souls, as if it were a campfire to broil what he swore was a piece of aged cheese. He rotated the spit with the dexterity of a chef, muttering that the hellfire gave it a special smoky touch. The silence that followed was heavier than the tomb itself. Malphus stared at his own hands, questioning his existence and power. Sir Valerius simply gave up on understanding and lowered his sword, defeated by the absurd logic of the situation. Takeshi, oblivious to the collective mental breakdown around him, withdrew his cheese from the residual flames. The stone, now overheated and dripping magma, which in Takeshi's mind was delicious fat, smoked before his face. He blew on it gently, his eyes shining with the pure anticipation of someone who had waited all day for this moment. The smell of sulfur and molten minerals flooded the room, but to him, it was the aroma of victory. He opened his mouth, his teeth ready to bite into something that would definitely shatter the jaw of any other living being, completely ignoring the 3,000-year-old demon who watched him in stupor. Takeshi Umori's jaw clamped shut with the violence of an industrial hydraulic press. The sound that echoed through the sacred chamber was not that of flesh being chewed, but rather the dry and terrifying crack of overheated minerals being pulverized. The magma, still dripping from the limestone, hissed upon contact with the protagonist's saliva, creating small clouds of steam that escaped from the corners of his mouth like the chimneys of a factory on a day of maximum production. General Malphus watched the scene with his 4 eyes wide open, paralyzed in a conjuration stance that now seemed ridiculous. He expected the human's head to explode, or his entrails to melt, or at the very least, for him to show a modicum of respect for the laws of thermodynamics. Instead, Takeshi chewed, and he chewed, and he chewed some more. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of crunch, crunch, crunch that made Sir Valerius's teeth ache with empathy. Suddenly, the chewing stopped. The expression of gluttonous ecstasy on Takeshi's face froze, slowly transforming into a frown of deep personal offense. He swallowed the mouthful with difficulty, as if it were bitter medicine, and looked at the rest of the stone skewered on his fork with the contempt an art critic would reserve for a stick figure drawing. With the authority of a disgruntled sommelier, Takeshi decreed his verdict. He pointed his fork accusingly at the demon, complaining that the cheese was unacceptable. According to his technical analysis, the product was past its prime, had an unforgivable sandy texture, and a strong aftertaste of 3,000-year-old mold. He even had the audacity to suggest that the chef, referring to the demon lord, needed to learn how to better control the oven temperature, as the center was rubbery. Ilara Dewdrop Leaf covered her face with her hands, waiting for the imminent incineration for such insolence, but the incineration did not come. Takeshi, wiping his tongue with his shirt sleeve, simply tossed the rest of the molten stone over his shoulder. The smoking projectile landed at the feet of Kalin of the Holy Spear, who let out a high-pitched yelp and jumped back to protect his imported leather boots. Without looking back, the glutton declared that the establishment was a fraud and that he would not be leaving a tip. He grabbed Ilara by the collar of her tunic and began dragging her toward the exit, muttering about needing a dessert to get the bad taste out of his mouth. Sir Valerius, realizing the demon was too catatonic to attack, made a frantic signal for everyone to retreat, seizing the miraculous opportunity to flee from an impossible fight. The final chamber of the Tomb of 1,000 Laments stood empty, except for the imposing and solitary presence of General Malphus. The dust settled. The echo of the invader's footsteps faded into the corridor. The demon looked at his own hands, where remnants of the black flames of the underworld still danced, and then looked at the piece of bitten stone on the floor. He tried to formulate a sentence of hatred, an oath of vengeance, but his ancient warrior brain seized up. He was not defeated by a holy sword. He was not sealed by superior arcane magic. He was appraised as a mediocre cook and cast aside. The humiliation was so alien, so far beyond any concept of honor or war that he knew that Malphus felt his legs give way. The armored giant fell to his knees. His 4 eyes spun in opposite directions, trying to find logic where there was only chaos. Rubbery, he whispered to the void, the word weighing more than 1,000 years of imprisonment. Outside, the sunlight of Solenia bathed the exhausted group. Takeshi, already recovered from the disappointment, pointed excitedly toward the horizon. In the distance, mountain peaks with strangely square and brown shapes rose against the blue sky. He swore he could smell cocoa on the wind, completely ignoring that they were miles away and upwind. Sir Valerius sighed, sheathing his sword, accepting that his fate now was to be the babysitter of a natural disaster. But they were not alone. In the shadows of the tomb's entrance, 2 red eyes glowed in the darkness, followed by another 2. Malphus watched. He had rationalized the impossible. That human was not an idiot. He was a cosmic entity in disguise, testing the patience and the cuisine of mortals. To defeat him, and reclaim his honor as a chef, as a general, he needed to study the enemy. The Soul Devourer took his first stealthy step out of the tomb, beginning the greatest and sneakiest espionage mission in history, determined to discover the secret behind that bottomless stomach.